Over New Year's, I took a brief trip to my hometown to visit my two brothers and a few close friends. To tell the truth, I have never been fond of my hometown. As soon as I could, I moved away. It was a very small, remote community that was miles away from any city or even nearby towns. The only residents were those who had lived there their entire lives, and everything was dilapidated and out of date. I only ever returned to visit my brothers and friends. Normally, I would spend a week at one of my brothers' houses, but this year, both of them had partners living with them, so I didn't feel like the odd man out. The town's only lodging option was a tiny family-run establishment located off the dirt road. It didn't even have a name, I believe. It was merely a hotel. I got there rather late. There was only one ancient truck in the parking lot. There was only one lamp behind the counter, so the lobby was dark when I entered. An elderly man with a disheveled beard, possibly in his 60s, with irregularly growing hair, got up from a chair upon seeing me. It appeared as though I had surprised him, or that he hadn't anticipated me. But then, in a harsh, low voice, he whispered, "Need a room." He led me to the room at the end of the hallway after giving me a key. It was an old hotel. It was ancient enough to feel somewhat unclean, but not so old that it was coming apart. It was also a little room. There's just a TV in front of the bed in the center. I reasoned that since I would only be here to sleep and spend the days with my pals, it didn't matter. After leaving everything packed, I quickly showered and fell asleep on the bed. But I did wake up at around 3 in the morning. The end to a gentle knock at the far end of the corridor, not at my door. Through the thin walls, I lay and listened to it. Silent, slow knocks that were spaced out, followed by a couple more. It sounded somewhat like the opening and closing of an old wooden door. The quiet thuds against the door frame are the knocks. I had no idea what was going on outside, but I didn't care, because this wasn't exactly a 5-star establishment. After a while, I went back to sleep. The lobby was deserted when I went to get coffee in the morning before leaving. Not a coffee shop or anything. There was nobody at the front desk either. There was no trace of the elderly man or any other employees. It was a little weird, but I ignored it and went to spend the day with my brothers. I spent a lot of time away. I believe I didn't return to the motel until around 9. There was only that one truck in the parking lot once more. The lobby lights had been turned out when I entered, and it felt cooler overall. The old man is still nowhere to be seen. I entered my room after walking down the corridor, locked the door, and changed into more cozy attire for the evening. That's when I heard it once more. Those odd pounding or thudding noises. It was only a few seconds until it ceased and became silent once more. However, it sounded like it was outside my room this time. I approached and slightly opened the door to see what was happening in the corridor. I hardly had time to notice that the door next to me was suddenly slightly open when I heard the man's voice calling to me from down the corridor. I jumped at that. Before I could answer, he moved back out of sight of the corridor after calling out for me to come down to the lobby. He didn't explain why or anything. I felt compelled to go down there and find out what he wanted, even though it was rather strange. Perhaps there was an issue with my room or something. I strolled up the corridor. The area remained silent. I was certain that I had to be the sole guest in this hotel at the moment. He wasn't there when I reached the end. I didn't even hear him moving around in the still dark lobby. As I stood in the foyer, I had a terrible sensation. Even though he probably didn't mean any harm, I didn't like the fact that I was myself in there. After a short while, I chose to merely return quickly to my room. That evening, I stayed up a little later, but I never heard the man entering the motel. I spotted him at the end of the corridor, and it seemed like he just walked away. I went to see my pals in the morning and told them about how bizarre the motel I was staying at was. They were all perplexed. They all seemed to concur that they had heard about the hotel's closure a year or two prior. However, None of them were certain, and stated that they were undoubtedly mistaken if I was staying there. Before returning late at night, I spent the entire day with them. I couldn't help but consider the chance that the establishment would be closed or unoccupied as I traveled there. However, it simply couldn't be. My room's water and lights functioned, and if it weren't open, the elderly man who works there wouldn't be there to give me a place. I arrived at the same location as the night before, an empty parking lot with only one truck. This time, I entered with a bit more caution. Nevertheless, most of the lights were off, and I didn't hear anything. I made my way to my room, but as soon as I reached the door, I froze. It was broken open. I opened the door even more, with a squeak. To be honest, I was afraid to go into the dark chamber. When I noticed that my bag was still largely packed, I made the snap decision to dash inside and retrieve it. Other than a toothbrush and other odd items I didn't care about, everything else I had left there was worth leaving. Not enough to take the chance of being there any longer, for sure. I began to rush out of there. I happened to turn around when I reached the end of the hallway and entered the dimly lit lobby. My entire body became numb when I looked back. I'm not sure if I had heard something unconsciously or if it was simply a feeling. I noticed the elderly man looking down at me from my room's doorway. I dashed to my car and headed to one of my brother's locations. To get the full story straight, he insisted that I call the police. It was worth reporting, even if it was merely a staff member prying into my hotel room. However, what we discovered was even worse. My pals were correct. It was empty. However, it's not necessarily abandoned. The landowners turned it down, moved away, and essentially left it there, even though it was still linked to the electrical system and everything. Additionally, there were no indications that the elderly man was present when the police examined the area. Even the old truck that had been there for the 3 days I was there had vanished. In fact, it appeared as though the cops didn't believe me at all, believing me to be a crazy person who had hallucinated the man and was utilizing the abandoned hotel as a free place to stay. Although they didn't explicitly state it, I could tell by the way they were speaking to me. I felt horrible about that entire community as a result. After spending a few days at my brother's house, I happily departed town and returned home. It was the most bizarre, perplexing, and genuinely terrifying experience I have ever had. Knowing what I was in the middle of, and how likely it is that I would never be seen again if I hadn't sensed something was wrong, and hurriedly left, makes it nearly harder to think back on it. Last Christmas, I went on a quick trip to spend time with my family. The idea was to meet up with some of my family at our cabin, which was located between where the rest of my family and I resided and a few hours south of the city. It was simply a peaceful mountain house that my parents had owned for many years, where we frequently got together for weekends or vacations. A small wooden house with a fireplace and a forest outlook. It was always serene, and all I truly wanted was that. Nor was this going to be a huge Christmas gathering. My sister, dad, and I made up my modest family. However, I chose to make plans for 5 days because I was driving alone. I could spend 1 there by myself and 4 with my family. I got there late in the afternoon 3 days before Christmas. When I parked, the woods behind the cottage were already shrouded in a haze from the sinking sun, and the sky was already growing darker. I simply strolled into the cabin, unpacked, took a lengthy shower, and slept through the night, because I only had a few hours before bed. The last time any of the family members had visited the cabin, I believe it had been more than a year. However, I had hardly ever been there alone before, so I couldn't tell if there was a serious problem. However, I reasoned that I would just let my parents handle that when they arrived. Furthermore, a cursory look revealed nothing unusual about the location. It was just as pleasant and serene as I had imagined. The next day was my one and only opportunity to spend the entire day by myself at the cottage. I therefore wanted to make it worthwhile. I got up early, brewed a steaming cup of coffee, and walked around the woods with it. Because of all the hikes we've taken throughout the years, there was a rough trail. It was only a 2-mile loop that went through the trees and back to the cabin. There was a little layer of snow on the ground from the previous night, and the weather was somewhat chilly that morning. It was calm in the woods. After about half a mile, I noticed some odd scuffs in the snow directly on the trail. Really, all I could hear was the wind blowing through the trees. I believed it might have been an animal, such as a deer. However, more distinct marks that were obviously shoe prints were seen lower down. They were also very different, as if they had just been manufactured. I took a look around. Particularly this near to our land, no one should have been in these woods. For a moment, the prints appeared to follow the path, and as I went along, I simply became uncomfortable and made the decision to go back. I wanted to be secure and just go back, even though I was positive it was nothing more than a hunter strolling about, or perhaps someone else had a cottage nearby. In the middle of nowhere, I most definitely didn't want to run into anyone. I spent the entire trip back trying to figure out why someone was out there, and it was pretty much all I thought about. When I finally saw the cabin, I nearly choked on my coffee as I approached the front door. Shoe prints could be seen all the way up to the door. It turned around after coming from the opposite direction where the track ended. They were obviously absent earlier. This indicates that whoever was out here was only a few minutes away from the cabin. Feeling as though someone was observing me, I anxiously scanned my surroundings, but all I saw was a desolate, snow-covered wilderness. The tension became too much for me to bear after a short while, so I hurried inside and locked the door. My heart was pounding. There was very little probability that this would occur, and the one day I spent here, it was significantly less likely when done alone. This seems like it couldn't be a coincidence. The problem is that I didn't lock the cabin when I left to take a quick stroll on my own land in the middle of a remote forest, because I didn't see the necessity to do so. I was pretty uncomfortable, but I sincerely thought that I was overreacting. For example, the person who found the path headed to a cabin looked through the windows to see if it was deserted or something, and then left when they realized I wasn't. Still, it was quite unsettling. Just in case, I gave my folks a call to let them know what was happening. To ensure I wasn't alone, they suggested that I stay the night at a hotel and wait for them to arrive the following day. It says a lot that my mom appeared more anxious about it than I did. However, I chose to remain. I was still going to exercise caution, staying inside for the remainder of the day and not opening the doors. Looking back, it was a pretty poor choice. The day went on forever. I wanted to spend this day by myself in tranquility and relaxation. However, it was the exact opposite of relaxing to know that I might not be alone out there. More than anything, I was paranoid. For the majority of the day, I drank while sitting by the fireplace in the living room. I need coffee to stay awake. I was exhausted, but I refused to go to sleep. I felt uneasy about closing my eyes, as if something might happen if I didn't remain vigilant. The day gradually came to a close. The sun began to set, and ultimately, it was once again dark outside. The woods surrounding the cabin were filled with an unsettling serenity. The small room I was in was only illuminated by the crackling fireplace. I couldn't stop thinking about those tracks approaching the cottage, even after all those hours. And as I grew increasingly exhausted and realized that I would eventually need to go to bed, I was anxious for a way to determine whether I was safe, such as a signal that they had truly vanished. And for some reason, it wasn't until then that I considered seeing where the footsteps went after arriving at the cabin. It would have been really unsettling if they had turned around and headed back toward the trail, or simply off into the woods. I stood up and opened the front door with a squeak. Outside, it was silent and completely dark. The forests in front were too menacing to gaze upon without feeling chilled. I peered down at the snow-covered shoe prints that were still frozen. I had a terrible feeling just by looking at them again. I continued searching for the shoe tracks that led away, and gradually I noticed that my face was becoming paler as I found no footprints pointing away from the cabin. It dawned on me when they approached the door and simply vanished at the entryway. The tracks remained when I left the cottage unlocked. I carefully pivoted and peered into the cabin's interior, where the fireplace cast a flickering orange glow. I had been in there all day with someone. I heard a faint creak down the corridor almost immediately after I was in line. I leaned forward enough to see the bedrooms down the hall. A man stood in the middle of the hall, slowly making his way toward the living room where I was, and my bedroom door was open. He hesitated for a second when he saw me, then charged toward me down the hall. I grabbed my keys from the wall, ran to my car, got in, and drove off right away. My rear headlights had stopped illuminating the cabin by the time I felt far enough to see in the mirror. Behind me, there was nothing but a black emptiness. After arriving in the closest town, I had the police examine the cottage and take my report. The dude wasn't there, of course, when the cops looked. They believe he was lurking inside the little standing closet all day, waiting for me to go to bed and fall asleep, because they did discover some scuffs on the bedroom floor. However, the fact that we just know that makes it much more unsettling. I had no idea who he was or what he intended to do to me. What if it was someone I knew, who was aware that I would be spending a day by myself in that cabin? It seems like a lot of coincidence, but I sincerely hope that's all there is to it, and that I won't have to deal with that man ever again. When it occurred, I was in northern Oregon. I can't recall the precise roadway. It was one of those deserted back roads encircled by miles of thick forest, not one of the main ones. To stay awake, I had been driving for hours with the windows open and the music on low. I believe this was meant to be a fairly typical road trip, where I would drive about, see a few locations, and get my mind off all the commotion. Nothing really thrilling. I had been keeping a fairly careful eye on my gas gauge, checking it sometimes, and attempting to fill it up when it was about a quarter of a tank. However, I suppose I went too far this time. I reasoned that I still had a long way to go before reaching the next petrol station when the warning light came on. I even entered my directions on my phone to find the next stop, and it indicated that it was 45 minutes away. Although it wasn't perfect, I believed I would still be all right. Even if I made a U-turn, there were no other closer possibilities, so I was undoubtedly a little anxious. Nevertheless, I continued driving, and after a while I looked down at my phone to find that it was 35 minutes. Maybe a few minutes later, I looked again and saw that the time was still 35 minutes. I recall gazing at that figure and questioning whether it was still accurate. It must have been a mistake or something. It wasn't until I checked again a few minutes later that I found the GPS was not updating at all. The little car icon wasn't moving, and it was stuck at the 35-minute mark. I began fiddling with my phone, pressing every button and attempting to reset the directions. However, my automobile sputtered before I could get it to function. My stomach dropped. I hoped that being low on petrol and not empty would only cause a brief, one-time incident. It hardly lasted for 30 seconds until it repeatedly sputtered. Wouldn't even consider turning back on. Unbelieving the predicament I knew I was in, I coasted to the side of the road and sat silently for a minute. I surveyed the area where I had found myself essentially stranded. There were no lights in the forest on either side of me, and the tops of the trees were shrouded in thick fog. As I sat there staring at it, I felt shivers. I was strangely alone. I reached for my phone and attempted to make a call for aid, but it took me 10 seconds or so to figure out why my GPS had become locked, and why my calls were now failing. I received absolutely no service at all. I realized how twisted up I was, and briefly put my head in my hands before getting out of my car. I reasoned that I might have been just 10 to 15 minutes from the petrol station, if my phone's GPS had been frozen at 35 minutes for a time. I mean, I had no way of knowing how long it had been frozen. I might be able to walk to the petrol station in around 30 minutes, if I'm lucky. Besides, what other option did I have? I took a tiny flashlight out of the glove box, used my key to manually lock the car, and began to walk down the street. It was quiet and deserted, but not in a good manner. It's so dark that I can hardly see anything through the fog. The darkness and eerie silence of the trees on either side of me was unsettling. Every time I looked over, my gaze was drawn to the shadows that filled the spaces between the trees, making even the smallest objects appear to be something they weren't. It was just my mind, creating shapes that didn't exist in the shadows. Thus, I made an effort to not even take a look. I continued to stare ahead at the never-ending road. Despite using a flashlight, the fog on the road made it difficult for me to see more than 10 feet ahead of me. However, after 5 minutes or so, I heard something. It was a couple branch fissures. It's definitely not the wind or the waving trees. I'm not sure if that was something stepping on a few branches or something else. I came to a standstill. The forest fell silent. I aimed my torch outside and gazed into the shadows. However, the longer I stared, the more uncomfortable I felt, seeing those shapes once more, and feeling that something might be staring back at me. Like something would happen if I stared too long. I turned my head away and continued walking, albeit a little faster, at least to avoid that region. After a short while, I saw something ahead on the right side of the road. Initially, all I saw was a big shape lying next to the trees. I assumed it might have been a tree that had fallen or something. However, I recognized it as a car as I approached, and managed to get my flashlight to light it up a little. Beyond the road's shoulder, an old worn-out automobile was halfway buried in the forest. Oddly enough, though, it didn't appear to have crashed there. It appeared to have been driven carefully to the tree line's edge by whomever it was, and then left there. The automobile appeared to have been there for weeks or possibly months, and the driver's side door was partially open. It was far enough off the road that no drivers would notice it unless you were walking along the remote area like I was. It genuinely scared me to see that car light up in my flashlight. The idea that someone else might have been present, also run out of gas, break down, or do something else. And if the car was still left here, whatever happened later was obviously not good. I didn't shine my spotlight into the trees or yell. I'm not sure why, but once more I felt a strong sense that something horrible would occur if I looked for too long. And as soon as I knew that I had to keep going, I heard another sound coming from the trees. Behind the automobile, there was a rustle in the bushes close to one of the trees, followed by another. For a brief moment, I believed my mind was tricking me once more as I turned in response to the sound. However, I noticed something. Just figures moving amongst the woods, with no faces or other details. There are several persons rushing through the trees, just out of sight. My entire body became chilled. I began to walk quickly down the street. I walked more quickly than usual, since I almost instinctively believed that I didn't want to appear like prey and demonstrate that I was scared by rushing. I made an effort to pretend that I was unaware of the footsteps that began to follow me into the woodland. Several footsteps followed me down the tree line, sets crunching through the woodland. I was actually too terrified of what I would see to even peek or shine my light over there. And for some reason, I didn't even hear or see a truck approaching me from behind during all of that. I wasn't even aware that he was there until the pickup truck pulled up next to me and a man yelled through the roll-down window. It appeared to be a typical dirty pickup truck. The man had a gray beard and appeared to be in his 50s. He appeared worn out, but not particularly menacing. You became stranded. Why are you strolling in this area? Anything is far away from you. I responded honestly, stating that my car ran out of gas and that I hoped to walk to the closest gas station because I was so shaken. The man nearly grinned as if I were crazy. Get in. You can go to the station with me, believe that you are much farther away than you actually are. Every sound and movement in the forest had ceased during this entire discourse, and it was once again completely silent. For those 30 seconds, everything seemed to stop. Despite my hesitation, I chose to enter. I never would have imagined myself hitchhiking in the middle of nowhere. However, I thought it would be worse to remain by myself by the side of the road with whatever the heck was going on. In any case, it seemed risky. However, it was profitable. In reality, the elderly man was merely attempting to assist. Additionally, he appeared to be as wary of hitchhiking as I was. He claimed that, although he resided on a farm an hour north and frequently traveled this way, he had never offered rides. I thought things might be seriously wrong when someone like me wandered around at night like that. I didn't want to come across as crazy, so I kept what I'd seen and heard in the forest to myself. It took far longer than I anticipated, nearly 25 minutes to get to the petrol station. If I had ever managed to get beyond that jungle, it would have taken me hours to walk there. The man also wished me luck and patted me on the shoulder when we arrived at the gas station. That was all. No unusual remarks or oddities, just a guy lending a hand. After purchasing a gas tank, I followed the clerk's advice and called the police to get assistance. He claimed that the local sheriff's office was courteous, offering to drive me back to my car and check on me. I'm glad I did, since it would have been terrible to be dropped off at my car by myself at night. We discovered my automobile when the police drove me there, but it had been moved. Nearly identical to the other automobile I had discovered there, it was off the shoulder and on the edge of the woodland. My automobile was pushed down there by someone, or that group, as if they didn't want anybody else to see it. I told the police everything at that point. In any case, the entire evening devolved into chaos. In summary, however, despite writing a report and conducting some investigation, nothing came of it. There were no residences in the area, no suspects, and nobody else had heard or seen anything. There were no license plates or other identifying details on the other vehicle they discovered. It's difficult to determine the purpose of those individuals in the forest or what they would have done if that pickup truck hadn't precisely arrived when it did.